Hello everyone, welcome to eTech Facebook Live Fridays. I'm Tech Bob, and today we're going to be reviewing the Tristar Repair, which is a pretty common board level repair that you've seen out on the social groups or just in general public. What this is whenever you have an iPad or a phone where it's having charging issues and you replace the charging port but the charging issues persist, typically it's going to be the Tristar chip. It has other names like the U2 or the A6310, and then there's different designations of that as well. Today we have Hector. I'll introduce Hector as well. Hector's one of our micro soldering technicians. He's going to be doing all the hands-on work today while I voice over what he's doing. Hector, what iPad is that?
That's the iPad 5th generation.
It's a 5th gen?
Yes.
Okay, so he has a 5th gen today that he's going to be doing the Tristar on. Before we actually start the micro soldering part of it, we're going to go over the testing part first. So the first thing we like to cover is how do you know if it is a Tristar issue? Now the biggest thing is going to be using a Tristar tester, but aside from that, you can just use an ammeter where it tells you how much current it's pulling. Typically the progression to this repair is if you change the charging port and it's still not working, next step would be the Tristar. So Hector's going to go ahead and plug up the Tristar tester. The tool he has in his hand is actually called the Smart Mod Tristar tester. It's from a German company, and this is the best Tristar tester by far that we've tested. There's other versions from China and other markets, but this by far has been the best one. It's just really consistent reading, so you can trust what you're plugging up to it. So it's pretty quick. He just connected it to the dock port. He's going to hit the quick test button, and then what it's going to do is test all the lines that feed through the dock connector to that chip. If it detects that some lines are bad, then it's going to let you know Tristar needed. So what does that say, Hector? Fail. So bring it a little bit closer to that camera up there so they can see it. There we go, that's good. So you see it says fail in big letters. Typically it'll tell you what it fails for. Sometimes this will tell you check battery or check charging port, but after you replace the charging port, check the battery, it's typically going to be the Tristar. So this is confirming it is truly a Tristar issue, so he's going to go ahead and disconnect that. And now we're going to get into the actual repair. So the first things we got to do is get to the Tristar itself. So he's removing the sticker that surrounds the connectors on the board. And that kind of, getting that out of the way gives you better mobility for working on the board. Plus you're going to be using a hot air rework station, and any type of stickers or plastic it's definitely going to melt. So he's getting that out of the way. And then the next thing he's going to do is pop off the EMI shield that's covering the actual Tristar chip. And these are just clipped on, so you can use a fine metal pick or some tweezers. And the good thing is on most of these boards, it's just clipped on like this. You may run into some logic boards where the chip is actually soldered on. A lot of iPhones do that. So it's a little bit more work to get to, but either way, same type of thing. You're going to get to that EMI shield. So he actually, I forgot to mention it as it was under the microscope, that component you saw underneath the microscope camera in the center, that was the actual Tristar chip. So I don't know if you saw in comparison to the camera on the bottom right side, I know the light's kind of bright, but that thing is smaller. It's probably about the size of a grain of rice or maybe a couple grains of rice. So that's just to put into perspective how small the chip is that we're working with. So that's the chip. He's going to move that out of the way. Hector, if you can bring the board under the microscope and show the location of the Tristar on the board. There we go. So it's that chip in that bottom left corner. Now, you can imagine to get to that chip, so if you look at where that EMI shield is, Hector, if you can point it out with your tweezers, just so it's clear. Move it a little bit up. There we go. So you see he's pointing out that chip. It's kind of tucked away in that corner, so like I mentioned removing the sticker, we're going to have to do some cleanup here too to get that chip easier. What Hector's going to do is remove that corner of the EMI shield kind of mounting bracket. He's going to be using the new polishing tool that we have, or it's called a polishing tool, but I showed this to remove strip screws in one of our last couple streams. You can use it to remove ICs, but also to remove that corner metal piece, he's going to grind the corner down to where it's easily removable. There's other ways to do it. In the past, before micro tools like this were available, some people have broken that corner off with pliers, but the problem with that is you're being really rough near a highly sensitive area, so you don't want to risk damaging anything. So I'm gonna move this camera view out of the way. You can see a little more what's going on. There we go. Move this one over. There we go. It's a better view. So he's grounding that point right there on the right side of the chip, and he's gonna do the same thing on the left. And again, you have to be really careful here because you can see there's it's either a cap or a diode to the right. You just have to make sure that you're not hitting anything. Because worst case, if you do, you can replace the components, but you don't want to cause more work. And again, the tool he's using, I demoed using to remove strip screws. But it definitely works great for this right here if you're having to remove portions of the EMI shield mount. You'll notice he's rotating the board a couple times. Just you want to have a better vantage point from where you're coming at with the tool. When working under a microscope, it's gonna sound kind of dumb to say, but seeing what you're working on is really important, which is obvious. But if you have not used a microscope, it does take some practice to get used to looking through there and control with your hands. That's probably the biggest learning curve we see for people we train on solder charging ports or any type of board level repair. You have to get used to being able to look through the microscope and then move your hands at the same time. It's something that our guys practice for years on, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible, but like this type of work right here is definitely on the like medium to higher level side. A charging port repair, I would say, is more on the entry level side because you're not having to grind away anything on the board. Or really remove any chip. You're just removing a flex cable, which it's flex to board versus chip to board. And if you guys have any questions as we're going through this, because this stream is going to be a little bit longer today since this is an actual repair that's being done, go ahead and drop them in the comment section. I'll try to answer them live as we go through here. It's a little bit easier being able to see the screen versus being in the screen as most of our streams are, so I can answer anything you guys may have. Or if you don't think about it till later, you can always drop it in the comment section after the video goes to our Facebook just as a post, and we'll answer it there too. And there we go. So what he just did gave him full access to the IC that's there in the corner. One thing that is super important that you'll see Hector do right now is clean off all those metal shavings. The metal shavings typically aren't big enough to bridge a whole joint between two components, but you always want to be safe. You never want excess metal anywhere inside the board. So he's using a brush. We use a combination of isopropyl alcohol or denatured alcohol works too, just to clean off that board. Because again, the cleaner you leave it, the better. The goal when doing any type of microsoldering repairs is to make it look like you were never there. It's just a better business practice and just tech practice in general. So now that he's done that, we have a clear view. Move it down a little bit, Hector. There we go. We have a clear view of that Tristar IC. So far, it's been getting to the IC. The next step is actually removing the IC. So what he's going to do is a little bit more prep work, and he's going to take some Kapton tape, which if you haven't heard that name, you may have heard polyamide tape or just heat-resistant tape. This is going to protect the area around the Tristar. That way the heat that he's going to be using with the hot air rework station doesn't cause damage to any other components. Or a bigger pain is you see all those little components around it. If your airflow is too high or you hit something with a tweezer, you can knock those loose and then have to play the game of putting them all back on. So highly recommended to protect the area around it. And again, you're trying to cover as much as you can without covering the IC you're removing, but this is important for protecting the board. All right, so you can see there he's kind of blocked off 3 sides of it. The right side, there's really not much you can do since that's the edge of the board. The next step he's going to do is use flux to lay it on top of the IC. Flux is used for a couple reasons. One, it helps solder flow. It kind of helps reduce the melting point too, so you're not sitting there with the heat gun as long trying to melt it. The flux also kind of provides a seal to the solder, which prevents oxidation. So when you are soldering it back on, you'll get a better solder joint, and you won't get cold solder joints where if the iPad's like bumped or any device is bumped, the solder will crack. So flux is definitely an important step of this soldering process. So now that he has the flux on there, the next thing he's going to do is use the hot air rework station. It's kind of hard to see on the camera in the bottom left, but it's on the other side of his microscope. We're using the Quick, what is it, Hector, an 861DW. It's been a pretty solid rework station for us. And the temperature we're using at, Hector, what is that, 380?
380 and 50 air.
So 380 is the temperature, and then 50 is the airflow. Now, this is one of the questions we get asked when we train people on soldering. Are the settings important? Yes, they are. You typically want to start lower and work your way up. 380 and 50 has worked great for us. The dangers of using a higher temperature is that heat can spread and cause other components to come loose, or other ICs to have what we call a popcorn effect, where the solder kind of popcorns out from underneath the IC. And if you have that happen on something major like your CPU or your PMIC, that's not good, because now it requires removal of that IC, reballing, and putting it back on, which is way more work than it's worth. And the second thing is on the airflow. If that airflow is too high, you see all those components around the IC that Hector's about to remove, it will actually blow away those components. So 50 is what we find to work best. Now from here, if Hector starts trying to remove it and it doesn't come off, he'll kind of adjust his settings. He'll go up on temperature or up on airflow, but you kind of take it slow from there. So what he's doing now, in his left hand, he has the hot air rework station gun. On his right hand, he has the tweezers. Typically, what we recommend is your dominant hand is doing the more precise work. So holding the tweezers is definitely the more precise work side, and then your non-dominant hand holds the tool, so the heat gun or the soldering iron, whatever it may be. And the question we'll typically get asked here is, how long is it going to take to remove that chip? On average, it's probably in the 60 seconds to 2 minute range. If you go past 2 minutes, I would definitely stop, let the board cool, and then try again. Again, too much heat for too long is never a good thing, whether you're doing board work or, like, say, a screen replacement or opening a device to get a battery out. So he's still heating there, and the way he's kind of figuring out if it's ready to go is just a slight movement of the IC. You're not trying to rip this thing off the board, because if you have not seen what's under an IC before, it's a lot of tiny little pads or soldering pads. They're little copper pieces that are very fragile. If you pull an IC up before the solder is melted, you risk ripping those pads or pulling them up. And if that happens, then you either have to rebuild the pads if you can do that, or the device is no longer fixable, because the pad is what the IC connects to, and if there's no pad, there's no connection for the IC. And you notice Hector's kind of moving the heat gun around. That's important. This is a smaller IC, but ICs in general, you want to make sure you're evenly heating the whole thing. If you only heat like from one side, it's possible the heat will get to that one corner, but not the whole thing. So you see there, I wasn't timing exactly, but that was probably about a minute if I had to guess. But the IC came off, and then what you're left with here is the pads on the board where the IC solders to. So if you look at this one, we can count them real quick on the screen. So it's a 2, 4, 6 by 6. So what is that, 36 pads? So these are the important things you want to make sure you don't damage. What Hector is going to do right here this is again another best practice thing. We have heard of some shops just popping the IC on at this point, but the issue with that is if you look at this, you can see it on the microscope camera, the solder is not even. So what we recommend doing is cleaning up the old solder, making sure it's all flush, and then we're going to apply a little bit more new solder and then solder the IC on. What this helps prevent is I guess the best way to say it is installing the IC and it being unlevel. And if that happens, the chance is that it's going to make contact with some points but not others. And the problem there is you're going to get a partially working Tristar, which doesn't really help anyone because that means the device isn't going to fully work with its charging capability. So what he's using right now, I don't remember if I said it or not, but that's a desoldering braid, which is basically just a lot of little copper braided wire. Copper typically attracts solder. So he's touching his iron to the top of that desoldering braid. It's bringing up the solder that's on the board, and it's just a better cleanup. Now, another cleanup tool that some people have probably heard of is like a solder sucker, where it's like a vacuum little thing that pops up and pulls the solder. That's usually okay for bigger soldering things, like maybe HDMI ports or game consoles, laptop ports, stuff like that. But when you're talking about something under the microscope, the desoldering braid's the only way to go, because that solder sucker thing, when you use that, it pops, and you don't want to risk that hitting the board, so we're using the braid. And you'll notice he's applying flux as he goes. General rule of thumb with flux is you apply it in between your steps. You definitely don't want to drown the board in flux, and that's another thing when people start out with soldering that they sometimes do, is they'll just flood the board with flux. Again, this is another one where I would start with a little and work your way up from there. You'll figure out what works best for you. In most cases, and the flux we sell is no clean flux, meaning you don't have to clean it because it's not going to cause any type of shorting between components. But it is recommended to clean it just because, again, it's a best practice to make sure that you leave everything as clean as you can from when you got it. So right now he's just wrapping up the cleaning of the pads. You'll notice it's kind of hard to explain the pressure he's using, because pressure is one thing that's relative, right? A lot of pressure to me may not be a lot of pressure to Hector, but in this respect, I would say light is typically the description for it. If you put too much downward pressure, you can risk pulling up one of those pads, and especially one thing you never want to do is take the iron away from the desoldering braid and just leave it there, because the chances are it's going to stick to those pads, and then if you pull the braid away, there's a chance it's going to bring up that pad. So you notice Hector will pull away the braid before he pulls away the iron, and that helps prevent that damage. Now again, on this one, it's 36 points, so it's not crazy as far as the number of pads, but there are some chips that are 50, so it's a lot harder to get it clean. I think the Touch IC Hector has more pads than this, right?
Yes.
It's probably around the 40 or 50 range. And that one, that's where you have to make a jumper and all kinds of stuff. But on the Tristars, typically they're pretty straightforward. Hector, move it down a little bit. There we go, good. So right now, he got the solder off. He just cleaned it with some alcohol. There's little fuzzes from the, he used a Q-tip, but you just clean that stuff off. Again, those little hairs aren't going to do anything, but again, best practice to clean it up. And you can probably guess what's coming next. So he's putting some flux on. And he's going to spread that flux a little bit. And now we're in the installation of the new Tristar phase.
Remember the position.
Oh, that's a good point. So Hector just mentioned, remember the position of the IC, because due to this being a square, it's 6x6, it can go on different ways, but it won't work. It's got to go back on the way it came off. So in this case, the letters, Hector, if you can tilt that a little bit, because I can't see the letters on it. Is your board upside down right now? Yeah. So the board is upside down right now, and the letters are going towards the bottom, so you can read it that way. There we go. So yeah, so if the board is upside down, the chip goes to where you can read the numbers and the letters that are on there. Really, another big tip here is if you're starting out with doing Tristars, just take a picture of it. That'll help you remember what it looked like when you took it off, because again, what you don't want to do is put the IC on there and then realize, oh, I put it on the wrong way, and have to try it the 3 other options. And there's just more heat you're applying to the board, and definitely something you don't want to do. So he's got it there in the right orientation. So another thing, you notice he cleaned off the solder, but he didn't apply new solder. So the reason for that is that the new ICs typically come reballed or balled with solder. So there's new solder already on that IC, so it doesn't require applying more. But he's got flux on there. He's got the IC mostly in position. And the cool thing, whenever you heat an IC like that, even if it's not perfectly aligned, as long as you're close, when you heat it, that solder is going to tend to grab other solder. So you'll see almost that effect of it moving into place on its own, like it's magnetic. It's not magnetic by any means. It's just kind of that surface tension is pulling it towards where it needs to go. So Hector's showing another Tristar as an example. Those are all the solder balls that are on it. So those are going to attach to the pads that are already on the board. Cool. And again, as far as putting it on, it's just the reverse of when he took it off earlier with the tweezers and the gun, the hot air rework gun. He's going to use the same temperature, 380, and then airflow of 50. He's going to wand over the IC to make sure that it sits down. And on this one, Hector, would you say it's about 60 seconds to heat? Okay. Sorry, he's busy. I'm going to try not to talk to him too much. And typically soldering, this is one thing you definitely don't want to do in front of a customer, at least if you're starting out, because it does require some pretty heavy focus. Hector's been doing it for a while, so he's gotten that down, but he's heating it until he sees a couple things. The IC is going to kind of move into position. We'll see if it shows that on the camera. Hopefully it gets a good representation of it. And then what he'll do, you see he has his tweezers on standby there. He'll kind of bump it to see if it's kind of fluid on there. That means the solder's melted. And then when you pull the heat gun away, when he gets to that point, not yet, he'll test it to make sure that it's actually soldered down on there. Worst case here, if you're on the low end and not heating long enough, is it won't be fully soldered. You just have to heat it some more. You definitely want to start on the low end though, versus heating too much, then damaging the components around it or the rest of the board. And apologies if anyone is commenting. I'm not seeing it on our comments side, so I'll answer them as soon as the stream is done. It might be a Facebook setting I'm just missing, but we'll definitely get to them as soon as we finish up with this. And another point here, so question we'll usually get is, if I know how to do a Tristar on one device and I know how to do it on others, the process is almost identical. The biggest difference is going to be where it's located on the devices. On the iPads, it's typically in the same area. It's that corner under the EMI shield. On iPhones, it's typically going to be on the lower half of the board. I don't recall if it's on the underside or top side. Hector would have to confirm that one. But typically, it's going to be in the same type of area. There we go. It looks like the chip moved around a bit, so it should be close. But you get to the chip a little bit differently, but as far as removing it and putting it on, what Hector just did, it's the same process. It's heating to remove it with the hot air rework station, cleaning up the pads, putting the new one on there, heating it, and then letting it sit down. So it looks like it's installed now. And you can pretty much tell if it's on there right or not. So you see how it's pretty much parallel to that bottom row of little filters, or I think those are resistors, those like 6 small components. If it was crooked, then obviously it did not go on there right. Yeah, so right there where Hector pointed out. You definitely want to remove the Kapton tape that you put on there. It's just meant as a temporary protection. And that's the case for if you're doing like a port or an FPC or a backlight repair, you name it. If you're using the hot air rework gun, that heat spreads more than a soldering iron does, so you'll typically need that. And you'll notice Hector definitely used the hot air rework station on this one more than the soldering station. The soldering station we have over there is the quick version of the soldering station. I forget the number. What is it on there, Hector? The 9? Well, that one over there.
380.
I think it was like a 380 or something like that. But it's the same Quick brand, which is pretty solid stuff. And Quick is known for having good equipment for a value, so you're not paying the arm and a leg of some other soldering brands, which I won't mention, but you do get solid stuff. And when I say solid stuff, the main thing I'm talking about is that it's equipment that holds temperature to what you set it to, because with some of the cheaper stuff, you'll run into issues. Bring that down a little bit, Hector. You'll run into the issue where you set it to 380, but it's actually at like 350, or something that's even higher, and that can cause issues either way. So now Hector is showing 2 ICs, and you can pretty much guess which is the old one and which is the new one that hasn't been used yet. The one on the left, you can see the solder's all shiny from where you heated it, and it's intact. So the question we'll get to is, how does the IC get damaged? And there's actually a couple ways that happens, but the biggest way by far is using a lower grade charger. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's not OEM, because there's some aftermarket chargers that are good too, but typically if you pay sub $2 for a charge, or even $3, those cables don't have the components in them to protect your board from current spikes or any type of other weird electrical things. When that happens, this is the IC that gets hit with it. The good thing is, think of it kind of like a fuse. This gets damaged so the rest of your device doesn't have to. It still requires a higher level knowledge of repair to replace, but at least it doesn't kill your whole device. So there's the side-by-side. I'm going to flip on this other camera again. So Hector's going to run the same test for testing the Tristar. All right, Hector, your other camera's on so you can show it. So he has his Tristar tester there. It's on. He's going to plug it in. And the cool thing about this Tristar tester, so you can use it pretty much in any device, I guess setup is the best way. So you notice here the board is out. You can use this with the board all the way together, which is preferred, because that way the customer, you can test it right there when they're in front of you. So you hit the quick test. It's running through. And now we have pass. So what it did was check the same traces or lines in that circuit before, and now it's detecting that all of them are receiving signal from the board, which means they're passing through the Tristar. So that right there in a nutshell is the Tristar repair. If you have any questions related to the repair, let us know. But again, as far as difficulty goes, I would rate this scale of 1 to 10 when it comes to soldering, probably in the middle, like a 5 or a 6. It's still considered an IC repair, but it's a more common one, and the IC is not as big as some others, so it's still definitely feasible. If you're looking to get into this and you don't solder at all, I would definitely recommend starting out with soldered charging ports, because that's going to be your #1 customer need just off the street. If you're supporting other repair shops in your area, like doing B2B work, then Tristar makes sense, because there's a lot of people that do soldered charging ports, but they don't do Tristar. And I will say that Tristar repair is kind of like a gateway into all the other higher level repairs. You'll start getting into like sandwich board repairs and Face ID recovery, things like that. But this was a good one to show everyone, to show kind of an in-depth on how the Tristar repair is done. If you're interested in another type of board level repair, let us know. We'd be more than happy to feature it. But I'd like to thank Hector for being on today. He'll most likely be on a couple other future streams. I don't know what we're doing for next Friday's stream, but we'll try to make sure it's as exciting as this one, or at least close. If anyone has recommendations, let us know. But we hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see everyone on next week's stream. Bye.